Welcome. Good evening. Let's talk a little about connection between war and the state. The paradox of war. The army, in the words of the writer Robert Heinlein, is a permanent organization for the destruction of life and property. Heinlein captures the essential paradox of every modern military establishment, that it employs large-scale and complex organization toward the ultimate end of physical destruction. War, the most violent of all enterprises, is also the most organized. In no other human endeavor, not in commerce, industry, education, religion, science, nor domestic politics, does collective action occur on such a large scale, and therein lies much of the burden and tragedy of modern politics, which for nearly 500 years has been driven by the organizational imperativeness of conflict. The battlefield itself is chaos incarnate, the most wretched area on earth, where death and devastation reign supreme. As William Tecumseh Sherman tersely observed, and every soldier in combat knows, war is hell. It is the blood-swollen god of Stephen Crane, the brain-splattering, windpipe-splitting art of Lord Byron, and epidemic insanity of Ralph Waldo Emerson. But if chaos and destruction are the hallmarks of battle, they are not the totality of war. Quite opposite conditions prevail, beginning immediately behind the front and extending backward to the seat of government. In the rear, order and regimentation reign. A complex logistics system procures and transports large quantities of equipment and supplies to the front. An encompassing bureaucracy trains and outfits reserve and relief forces. Hundreds of munitions factories manufacture the weapons and material of war, employing the most intricate and advanced technologies known to science. In a major war between industrial powers, large segments of the civilian population are mobilized for service in the armaments industry or in burgeoning wartime bureaucracies. A central government directs the whole of this vast effort, using extraordinary and often extra-legal wartime authority to tax, regulate, confiscate, ration, conscript, and otherwise mobilize the resources required to wage the contest. Thus, except at the front itself, war is a demonstrably organized and organizing phenomenon. Physicists measure the degree of disorder inherent in a given molecular system by its entropy. A high degree of entropy means a low degree of organization and order, while low entropy means a high degree of structure and organization. If human beings at war are viewed as atoms, and as such they are often treated during war, then war can be seen as an activity in which the negative entropy of the rear suddenly explodes into the extremely high entropy of the battlefront. No other human phenomenon and few natural phenomena display such a striking shift in entropy. Physicists also link entropy to time, and many combatants speak of a marked shift that occurs in the human perception of time during battle. This is not entirely subjective, for what would require years, decades, and generations in peacetime can happen during war in weeks, days, or even hours. The intensity of military conflict unleashes or accelerates numerous forces for change, transforming industry, society, and government in ways that are fundamental and permanent. From this paradox of organized destruction flow other paradoxes of war, for example by weakening or destroying traditional structures or by compelling internal reforms. War may create conditions conducive to social change and political modernization, but modernization in this sense should not be taken to imply moral progress, for it may represent just the opposite. The tendency of social scientists until recently to commit the fallacy of associating modernization with progress only betrays the strong hold that evolutionary models have had on scholarship over the past century. Modernization, as used in this book, simply means movement from medieval, traditional, decentralized, and personal forms of government to bureaucratic, rationalized, centralized, and impersonal forms. The modern is not necessarily superior to the traditional, depending on the specific case. Traditional forms may be culturally richer and offer greater scope for human liberty, while modern forms may be sterile and repressive. That war may serve a modernizing function says as much about the moral ambiguities of modernity as it does about the nature of war. What then is the role of warfare in history? Liberal and progressive conception of history regard war as a transient phenomenon, an anomaly in the inexorable upward progress of civilization. Hegelian, Marxist, and fascist interpretations of history see war as a dialectical engine of that progress. Both conceptions disregard the tragic side of history. Wars are not mere intermissions in a human drama of relentless progress. Their organizational residues are woven too deeply into the fabric of modern politics for that. But neither is war necessarily an engine of progress. It is instead a powerful catalyst of change, the direction of which is always morally problematic and often deleterious in effect. Regardless of whether a given war is just or unjust, defensive or offensive, positive or negative in its long-term consequences, military conflict tends to unleash the most primitive of human passions, often with enduring consequences for the moral fabric of the societies that wage it. One consequence of European warfare from the Renaissance to World War II was an increase in the size and power of central governments. By imposing peace on violently divided societies, strong states helped avert the Hobbesian twin catastrophes of civil war and anarchy. Unfortunately, the price of this dividend was too often the loss of political freedom. Here we confront yet another paradox of war. The military power required to defend against foreign aggression can easily be turned to internal repression. A government at war is a juggernaut of centralization determined to crush any internal opposition that impends the mobilization of militarily vital resources. This centralizing tendency of war has made the rise of the state throughout much of history a disaster for human liberty and rights, a triumph of raw power by conditions of large-scale violence. The Swiss economist J.C. de Sismondi spoke of this in a letter to a friend in 1835. As war becomes more sophisticated, it continuously increases governmental authority and decreases the power of the people. The result may be what Harold Laswell called garrison states, political systems obsessed with national security, where perpetual war or the perceived threat of war leads to the concentration of all political power in the hands of an elite devoted to violence. Carried to an extreme, the logical culmination of increasing state power is the totalitarian state, whose rise in the 20th century should have discredited forever that casual assumption of the Enlightenment that history was a linear march toward utopia. Not surprisingly, the intellectual precursors of totalitarianism included a diversity of 19th century thinkers who glorified war as a wellspring of progress. The social Darwinists saw war as a means of sifting the wheat of humanity from its weaker chaff. Their chief spokesman, Herbert Spencer, saw the triumph of the strong over the weak as the decrease of a large, far-seeing benevolence. He argued that past competition among militant societies had weeded out weaker individuals and prepared the war for the emergence of a new industrial society led by men of high character. Heirs of the militant conquerors of the past. In the decades leading up to World War I, various heirs of social Darwinism, Arthur de Gobineau, Georges Sorel, Ernst Jünger, Oswald Spengler, Heinrich von Treitschnecke, rejected the liberal heritage of the Enlightenment and became increasingly militant, racist, and imperialist in their pronouncements. Glorifying war, they inevitably came to glorify the state. Treitschke wrote of the sacredness of war and declared in words which prefigured fascism that the grandeur of war lies in the utter annihilation of puny men in the great conception of the state. Another pre-Darwinian lineage of the totalitarian mind traces back to the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who also saw war as an agent of progress. As a result of war, nations are strengthened, and the state as the highest manifestation of divine wisdom working in history. Hegelian philosophy influenced both social Darwinism and the development of fascist doctrine in Europe, but its greatest impact was on Karl Marx and the rise of totalitarian ideology on the left. Marx identified class conflict as the engine of human progress, and Lenin wrote that class contradictions continue to exist in war, which for him was simply one of their manifestations. But while the Nazi states took seriously the notion that total war of the total state would bring utopia, Lenin and Stalin were more expedient, turning Clausewitz upside down. They turned politics into the continuation of war by other means, and the state into an engine not so much of actual warfare, but of permanent military mobilization. But the mobilization imperative of war does not always culminate in total state power. In certain circumstances it can actually foster democratization. This occurs when the state's demand for war-fighting resources gives bargaining leverage to the holders of those resources. Max Weber, despite his hyperbole, captures the crux of this process. The basis of democratization is everywhere purely military in character. Military discipline meant the triumph of democracy because the community wished and was compelled to secure the cooperation of the non-aristocratic masses and hence put arms and along with arms political power into their hands. The right of the medieval estates in England to give consent on matters of war and taxation, the latter invariably levied for war, was the foundation of the English Parliament. The triumph of popular sovereignty in France was closely linked with the advent of the mass army. In the United States, white male suffrage made its greatest advances after the War of Independence and the War of 1812, and black male suffrage after the Civil War. Women in the United States and nearly a dozen European countries received the right to vote at the conclusion of World War I. It was not by chance that the one country in Renaissance Europe requiring active military service of all adult males, the Swiss Confederation, was also the only country with almost universal manhood suffrage. Perversely, it was also the last country in Europe to grant women the right to vote, not taking the step until 1971. The logic apparently was that if they didn't fight, why should they vote? One gun, one vote. World War I, perhaps better than any other conflict, starkly illustrates the moral and political paradoxes of war. In the midst of its unrelieved carnage, the governments of France and Great Britain implemented extensive social, labor, and welfare reforms. In Britain, these included vastly improved infant and child care programs, better maternity care, regulations on safety and hygiene in the workplace, free elementary education, public housing programs, and the new Ministry of National Health. In France, the state introduced minimum wages, rent deferrals for disadvantaged workers, stricter safety regulation in factories, and expanded medical services for workers. In both countries, trade unions made rapid strides during the conflict. Ramsay MacDonald, leader of the British Labour Party, fought a bitter opponent of the war, acknowledged that it was doing more for the social agenda of the left in Britain than half a century of efforts by progressive reformers. Léon Ambesseur, an early historian of French feminism, claimed that French women made more progress during World War I than in 50 previous years of struggle. The irony that the bloodiest war in the Europe history had advanced social reforms found expression in the title of a book by historian Deborah Dwork, War is Good for Babies and Other Young Children, a study of child welfare in England between 1898 and 1918. Dwork's whimsical title was obviously overdrawn in its implied optimism. In the total scale of human affairs, the social reforms of 1914 to 1918 might be judged as mere societal soaps by comparison with the mindless bloodletting of a war in which millions perished in order to move battle lines back or forward a few kilometers. Nor is it accurate to regard the violence and bloodshed of the war as having directly caused the social and welfare reforms of the period. War gives impetus to collective action and social organization, but it is the some purposeful agent of change that mysteriously spawns positive social goods from tragedy and destruction. The social reforms of World War I were not direct consequences of the war's violence. Rather, they were an indirect outcome, the result of human agency responding, even in a kind of moral backlash, to the senselessness and violence of the conflict. That is, they were an attempt to transcend the violence of the war, to distill positive reforms from the crucible. A final paradox of war, one that is peculiar to democracies, and especially to the American case, is what might be called the liberal-conservative conundrum. Liberal and reform-minded political leaders abhor war, but recognize the opportunity it presents for social reform. Conservatives revere military institutions and traditions, but are often wary of actual conflict. Sensing its potential for revolutionary change, in 20th century America, democratic presidents have gone to war more readily and more often than their Republican counterparts. American political dialogue also reveals the irony of pro-military conservatives rallying against big government, while forgetting the coercive taxation and bureaucratic organization are the sine qua non of funding and equipping arms forces in the industrial age. Conversely, anti-military liberals embrace the power of the state to accomplish social ends, but are not always mindful of the military origins of that power. The manifold paradoxes of war penetrate the very heart of the modern state, its capacity for mass organization. Medieval rulers could hire engineers to devise imposing war machines, but they had no conception of the bureaucratic state as the greatest war machine of all. The analogy of the state as a machine has been invoked repeatedly since the Renaissance, but rarely more effectively than by Mitchell Goodman in The End of It, which depicts the immaculate contraption of the US Army in Italy during World War II. In Naples they had everything by now. A big business installed in old and new palazzi, equipped by the international business machines. Corporation, you need a rifleman, punch a button, a card falls out, orders are cut, he is put in a shipment and shipped, from the training center to the grave. Punch a card. Nothing is left out in this universal corporation. The vertical and horizontal corporation. All phases: marketing, transport, supply, legal, archives, insurance, information, public relations, entertainment, medical, surgical, dental, psychiatric, graves, registration. Palazzo after palazzo full of the corporation, grinding out way bills, due bills, requisitions, contracts, memos, orders, procedures. It grew as all the best corporations grow, until it was beyond the comprehension of one man, and existed for its own sake. Goodman's portrait brings to mind the observation of H. G. Wells. during World War I. We have discovered that the modern economic organization is in itself a fighting machine. In the bowels of the vast war machines of modern states, some individuals thrive, finding fulfillment in collective effort, others suffer as mere cogs in the machine. The contradictions of modernity, its social fluidity and mobility on the one hand, its anomy and depersonalization on the other, reach their apex in the experience of war. The machinery of the modern state is derived historically from the organizational demands of warfare, and states as we know them today trace their origins and development in large measure to the crucible of past wars. In the classic formulation of Charles Tilly, war made the state and the state made war. Historians and students of politics have generally underestimated the role of organized mass violence in shaping politics as we know it today. There may be a reluctance to confront the military lineage of modern state, for the implications of that lineage upset conventional notions about Western civilization on both the right and left wings of the political spectrum. But it is impossible to understand the nature of modern politics without considering its military roots. What Ernest Renan called those deeds of violence which have marked the origin of all political formations, even of those which have been followed by the most beneficial results. How beneficial or otherwise those results have been, the reader may judge in the following pages. The organization of this study is as follows. Chapter 1 sets forth the theoretical underpinnings of the study. It defines key issues and identifies the principal effects of war on the state. Chapters 2 and 3 examine the rise of the early modern state from the 100 Years' War to the Peace of Westphalia, with particular attention to the role of the Italian Wars and the wars of religion in shattering medieval structures and midwifing the passage to political modernity. Chapter 4 traces how the dynastic states of the 18th century became true nation states as a result of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Chapter 5 examines the impact of industrialized warfare on the evolution of European states, with particular attention to the rise of the welfare state. Chapter 6 explores the military origins of totalitarianism in its Nazi and Soviet varieties, and Chapter 7 concludes with an examination of the American case. Isolated from Europe and Asia and imbued from the beginning with an anti-military, anti-statist spirit, America offers by far the most difficult test of the proposition that warfare and military power lie at the foundation of modern politics. It turns out to be but a partial exception. The interconnections between war and the state are numerous and complex. Our attention in the following pages will range from Cromwell to Lenin, from the tax structure of 16th century Castile to the social welfare system of Imperial Germany, from the demolition of private fortifications in central France under Louis XIV to the growth of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs during World War II. Like most studies of war, this inquiry will undoubtedly raise more questions than it resolves, but that is the inevitable price of asking. Ripeness is all, observed Edgar, son of Gloucester, in King Lear, and as the historian Herbert Miller reminds us, it is enough, quite enough.